Thank you for joining us again and welcome back to Chatsworth as we continue on the journey of the stories of the house and the collection it contains.
We're now in the Great Chamber, and it's a big room, the first room in a suite of rooms that flow along from this on the south front of the house. And this was part of the 4th Earl, who became the 1st Duke, his rebuilding of this entire front of the house. It was his first endeavour in moving from the Elizabethan property into this new English Baroque home. And the Great Chamber's a fascinating space because it's not hugely furnished. In fact, it's quite empty. And that's how it probably would have been, because it was intended as a reception room. So if your monarch was visiting, this would have been where they would have held court. And it's decorated with carved lime wood by Samuel Watson, and then the ceiling by Verrio, which has this incredible array of mythological characters on the ceiling.
And I think, as you say, this suite of rooms, very much within a secular house, the place where the visiting monarch would reside. It's a suite of rooms that gets more and more intimate as you get towards the bedchamber and the closet, and the furnishings become ever more rich as you go through. And in fact, the bedroom, we know that the 1st Duke actually spent more combined on that room than almost any other room in the house. So these suite of rooms were completed by 1694 when he was ennobled and went from being the 4th Earl to the 1st Duke. Unfortunately, William and Mary, the new Protestant monarchs, never actually visited. But again, there's so much meaning in the works that are here. So Verrio, again, riffs on the idea of the coming of peace, prosperity, goodness. So we have Cybele representing Mary, an earth goddess, bringing those sort of that sense of triumph and rebirth for the nation. So Alex, here we are in the 3rd of the staterooms, the music room, and we're going to look again at the Kip and Niff engraving, which shows Chatsworth in around 1699. So I think, again, the lovely thing to point out is we're moving into the sort of the classical phase of the house. We've got that sort of classic front there, but we also shows the sort of formal French gardens as they were at that period. And obviously over the next sort of 20 years, they would become progressively more in the Dutch style and a lot more relaxed and empty, as was the fashion of the royal court at that time with William and Mary. And I think what I particularly love about this, when we're looking at this elevation of the house that we're on at the moment, is what we can see is starting to happen along the sort of the roof level.
Yeah, so as this front of the house is built, there's a kind of parapet which hides the roofline behind it, kind of inside the inner court of the house. So we're in a room just about here in the top middle of the building, and we're looking out this way. This is looking south. So what we have here is these very formal parterres, very decorative planting and pathways. In the middle is this pond of seahorses and triton,
Which still exists.
So we can use that as our kind of guide to where these gardens were. Where this fence line is here, there's a pathway, and then here there's a more formal garden in this drawing, whereas now here there's a long canal pond. So it's just, it's interesting that the axis of the garden, even though it doesn't really look like this anymore, still continues looking south.
No, it's wonderful to have this snapshot, isn't it? Because this really is a time of huge change, not just for the house, but for the garden, for the purpose of it. This is something that is, this is now a powerhouse.
Yes.
And now this is all about the impression, the approach, and the effect that this house had on its landscape and the people who would approach it.
Yeah, so the 4th Earl becomes the 1st Duke, his status changes, but I love that, we're now looking forward from this house, but we still have, it's in flux.
Yeah.
We still have the Tudor front here of the house, and even on this brand new south front of the house, there's a little bit of the Tudor house that still peeks out of the corner, because it's very difficult to resolve your building when you're kind of building on the footprint of the space that already exists. And that problem, that dilemma, is something that the 1st Duke encounters on his kind of building programme, because there are different floor heights and the way in which the rooms and the inner court is orientated. So there's a constant dilemma of resolving all of those rooms as his building project carries on.
And it would have been extraordinary to actually live in that building project. You know, I mean, this was one of the first houses in England to be built by contract, and we know that that did not end well. The Duke did not like having that sort of contractual interference between him and his workers. But in a sense, one of his key things which he later used in court was that this house was supposed to be habitable the whole time, that these huge wings were being torn down and rebuilt. So it is, you know, it is extraordinary to think that there was a family and a household living here as it evolved. So Alex, now we find ourselves in the state closet, which is the last room on the enfilade along the south elevation. And this is a very intimate space, isn't it? This is where only the sort of the closest to the monarch would reach. And we find ourselves with this extraordinary object here. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yes, this is an English silver chandelier from the 1690s. What's interesting about this object is that it has both the emblems of the Earl and the Duke of Devonshire, so it marks that real moment of transition in his status. It's also a portable object, so it has its own carrying case, and it would have moved from house to house. And it's great to find it here in this most intimate of spaces. And of course, when the first Duke built this enfilade of rooms, the way to get to this space was only by going through the rooms that we've been through.
So not much privacy.
So not much privacy. There were no interconnecting corridors. So in a way, to get to this space, you would have had to have kind of sought various permissions and be of a certain status.
And it must have been incredibly difficult then when the Duke was, well, subsequent Dukes were obviously adapting this house to the sort of the growing sense of private space. That would have caused all sorts of issues, which I'm sure we'll touch upon when we go further into the house.
Yes, I mean, and there we revisit again the making and remaking of this house. So we're talking at the moment of the transition from the Tudor property to this English Baroque house, but there are more changes to come. So here we are in the Painted Hall. It's one of 12 major painted spaces at Chatsworth, and it's a reception hall. It's where people would be welcomed, and it's huge and painted in amazing colours and gold, and it is really an impressive space. We know that in 1688, the old Elizabethan part of this house was starting to be taken down. So the story starts really with a process of demolition before this space is rebuilt in its place.
So this is also where I think the real statement of sort of Whig supremacy is writ large for those people who are arriving at Chatsworth, because this is a place where, you know, this is the welcoming space. This is the place where all the messages you want to make about yourself are being made. And I think for the first Duke, when Laguerre is painting this in 1692-4, that is very much about what the new King William means to the country, and that's about the bringing of the new dawn. He's the new Caesar, so there's, you know, Caesar is writ large all across this space. And there are images here and stories that can be got from that imagery. So we've got Caesar crossing the Rubicon on one side, obviously that would spark the Civil War, and then on the other side you've got crossing the English Channel, which is what William did, obviously, to come over. So there's so much going on here. There's celebration, there's reaffirmation of Protestant faith, but there's also a subtle warning here. This is about, you know, the growth of political power, landed power. So we've also got the warning of the assassination of Caesar. So it's almost saying, remember who helped you here, and remember not to overstep the bounds of your legitimate power.
So this whole space is a really fabulous metaphor for power at that time.
Yes, and also just a space that really sets you up for what you're going to see across this extraordinary house.
So Alice, we find ourselves in the chapel, which is one of the most remarkable rooms at Chatsworth, not least because the decoration and the architecture is pretty much as the first Duke made it. And we're talking here around 1688 to 1693. So we have the amazing altarpiece, the painted walls and ceiling, and then wooden panelling with carving as well. And what's incredible about this is that it all works together in concert, and this is really, we think, typical of the English Baroque.
Absolutely, and I think what's so interesting is there's so much meaning that is threaded into almost every aspect of this space. This is very much, as you say, a Baroque space, which I think most people would very much associate with the Catholic faith. But of course, this is a Protestant chapel, and this was very much built on the footprint of what would have been the Elizabethan chapel that had come before. And I think having things like, you know, on this amazing altar, these two figures were carved by Cibber, and they're Justice and Prudence. And that's much more this idea of a growing sort of political class who would have a lot more power underneath the king. And I think, you know, having Doubting Thomas in this beautiful work by Verrio really much sort of starts to bring in that idea about evidence-based sort of faith and society.
Yes, so there's a lot to think about. And we must remember this room, of course, was a functioning chapel, so there would have been prayers in here every day. So imagining the whole household gathering here and being together and experiencing this space as a place of prayer. And, you know, there's just an incredible amount to look at in here. I think your eye can travel along the carvings in the wooden panelling, the carvings on the altarpiece. These are both by Samuel Watson, who was this kind of extraordinary carver who worked in all different kinds of material at Chatsworth. The other thing that I think is really great here is that the painting and the sculpture, there are these trompe-l'oeil moments. So there's moments where the sculpture kind of transforms almost into the painting, and when the architecture of the room also is mirrored in the wall painting, so your eye is constantly shifting between the reality and then this painted or sculpted vision around us as well. So it's such an interesting and intricate environment.
I think it's also really important to think that this was really one of the sort of the first steps taken by the first Duke. Obviously, when this started, he was still the fourth Earl, not quite yet the first Duke. But I think, you know, interesting as he was really going to become the sort of architect of this part of Chatsworth that we're now talking about during this episode.
And of course, what he was doing was taking this Tudor house, which by that point was pretty old-fashioned, and he was reworking it and remodelling it. So he begins here. We're in the southwest corner of the property, and this is the place where we know from the account books that the building work really starts.
And here we actually see Watson's design for the altar.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, I think, to see this drawing, which shows his mind at work in this decorative scheme for the chapel.
And he's even included other people's work that is going to be placed within it. I think that's what's so clever. So here we see the south front of the house, and this is the very first sort of front of the house that was remodelled by the fourth Earl, first Duke. And he chose a relatively unknown architect to work with him on this.
Yeah, so it's William Talman. So William Talman then went on to great things. He was surveyor of the King's Works at Hampton Court. But at this stage, yes, relatively little work behind him. But here we've got the south front, and of course this is the front that contains the state apartment on the second floor and also the chapel, which is where all the work began. So that's what's just behind this magnificent facade. Now we're looking at the east front of the house, and the first Duke has moved his building works from the south front, which he completes, to the east front, and he's working on reconciling the corner of that house with the old Elizabethan wing, which he has to demolish and rebuild again. It's a very complex building project.
And he had only initially thought to do the south, hasn't he? It was sort of like he was almost bitten by the building bug after that. But I think it was because he found that there were so many things he had to reconcile.
So we've moved from the completion of the south front of the house, we've looked at the east front of the house, and then in 1700 the Duke turns his attention to the west front of the house in his kind of rebuilding of the whole of the property. And what we get with the west front is something quite different, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of shift in confidence. He'd obviously employed William Talman as his first architect, and I think they sort of parted ways. I think the Duke was someone who liked to be part of a collaborative process, and I think that was a struggle with Talman, whereas I think at this time Thomas Archer comes on the scene, and although we don't have any actual plans that say that Archer worked with the Duke on the West Front, I think we can say that Archer's influence was certainly starting to show. And I think what's really interesting about this, which is a plan by Fitch, which is part of a series of plans. Fitch was one of the Duke's builders, really, well, master of works. And I think what's interesting is you're starting to see quite a sort of confidence in the architecture. So you've got these incredible kind of pilasters here on the front, which is on a sort of very classical facade. So this is really confident building.
And we've got what does survive from the idea in this drawing, I think, is this the strong central feature of the elevation with this triangular pediment, which is quite different than we've seen on the south and east fronts of the house.
Absolutely, but what is more striking, I think, is the fact of how similar this is to the double height pavilion, the Royal Pavilion at Marly in France. And we know that the Duke wouldn't have seen it in person, but he must have either seen an engraving or been influenced by someone who is, because I think you can agree that there's such a strong correlation between the two. So Alex, here we are in front of this monumental painting by the Flemish artist Jan Sieberix, and I think what I take from this painting more than anything is the fact that we now have these classical facades to the house. So we've got a completed south, east and west front we can just see over the top with its pediment sculpture. And I think it's a snapshot because this is taken in the last years of the first Duke's life. It's just wonderful to see this as a live drawing as opposed to, I suppose, the engraving that we saw previously.
So we were looking at the Kip and Niff engraving, which is black and white. What's really interesting about seeing the garden in this painting is that it's in colour. So we can see how the whiteness of the statuary stood out in the greenness of the lawns and the landscape. We can see the colours of the flowers in the parterre. We can see that the ancillary buildings to the north of the house were brick. So, from an engraving when black and white, you're not quite sure of the materials, but here we can definitely see that they're in a red brick. That contrasts very strongly with the whiteness of the house.
I also just love the fact that we can actually pick out sculpture that's still in the garden today, where it was. I mean, obviously this is a far more formal garden than we're used to seeing now.
And of course the garden itself is very distinct from the landscape below, which is something that would change dramatically in the years to come. But here we have this very kind of delicate, elaborate setting for the house in this much wider landscape. I think one of the garden features we must talk about in this painting is the Cascade House and the Cascade, because of course that is a change to this painting. So when this painting was made, that wouldn't have been a feature, it wasn't yet built. And we can see from the way that it's painted that it is a later addition to the painting. And what's brilliant for people who come and see this painting at Chatsworth is that from the windows of this room, you can see that Cascade House still in situ. It's one of the survivors of the garden over the centuries.
So as we approach the Cascade, I think it's really interesting to consider in what sort of context this arrived at Chatsworth, this idea of having a cascade. I think very much inspired by the 4th Earl, 1st Duke's time at the French court of Louis XIV and some of the amazing work that was going on there.
So what we're looking at now is this kind of run of water that comes down the hillside towards the house. And what we see today isn't the first cascade that appeared at Chatsworth. There was a much smaller one that was designed by the Frenchman Grillet. And then this was built not long afterwards, an extended and enlarged cascade. And then eventually we get the Cascade House at the top of the hill, from which the water emerges through various fountains and spouts and so on. It's quite a complex structure that's kind of filled and surrounded by water. And the water for that is gravity fed from the hilltop above, and there was a lake dug there by the first Duke in order to supply the water that then runs down and feeds all the fountains and the cascade that flows from it.
And this is all part of that sort of lovely 18th century idea of the sort of fun and the exuberance of having these water features within your gardens, you know, to delight the visitor as they wandered around. And what I think is really interesting is what we've ended up here with this Cascade House, which is designed by Thomas Archer, is very much a much more simplified version. We've moved from this sort of quite ornate, over the top maybe idea of the French design to a much more restrained classical concept, maybe closer to a sort of Dutch model. I think what's extraordinary here as well is we're just seeing all of that virtuoso work that we see so much of on, you know, the interior and exterior of the house. So again, we have the hand of Nadeau and Watson and Gerritsen, who had succeeded Cibber. And it really is quite wonderful. I mean, not only the monumental sculpture, but also the frostwork, which is so extraordinary.
Yes, and I think for me, sometimes the Cascade House is a little bit like, in microcosm, all the things that were happening in the house during that time, the architecture, the sculpture, the sensory sound of water, it's all coming together in this garden feature.
Yeah, and something that seems so almost permanent has been so moved. You know, it's been lengthened. It's had the Cascade House added. It's had various bits of its water features sort of simplified and taken away. So we end up with this really serene space, and which gives you such beautiful views across the landscape as it developed.